We realize that there are a lot of people who love our complete videos on the topics that we cover. However, we do now have two feuds and one murder mystery that this would be an impossible task, as each of them would run over 6 to 7 hours in one go. These are the bloody Breathitt County Wars, Killing Rock, and now the myths and truths of the Hatfield and McCoy feud. It turns out that just from what we have recorded so far in the Hatfield and McCoy feud, it has been close to a whopping 3 hours in a compilation video. So instead of doing what might turn out to be a 6 hour video all at once, we are going to break the compilation up like we did with the Killing Rock or Pound Gap Massacre videos and the Breathitt County Wars. The first Hatfield and McCoy feud video is just over 2 hours and 30 minutes long. The compilation video will take the feud from the introduction through the end of Chapter 6. All of the introduction and endings from the previous videos have been cut to make a seamless story.
In the United States, there was a time where truth and journalism was not celebrated, and tabloid-like articles ruled the day. This time period was called yellow journalism. This was started around the 1890s to fuel the competition for their bored readers and paper sales between the World and Journal, which was located in New York City. This competition soon spread to other cities and towns across the United States. The most popular topics of the time period was the Hatfield and McCoy feud, the Wild West stories, and believe it or not, the Killing Rock Massacre. A lot of myths about these stories comes from these articles written in the newspapers. We found this full-page article in The Sun, located in New York, concerning the Hatfield and McCoy feud, and we thought that it would be fun to pick it apart to separate the truth from fiction that is still being played out on the television and movie screens to this very day. In today's look at the article, we will begin with the introduction. This series will be each chapter first, as it is written in the newspaper, then we will pick it apart to discover what really happened historically. Come along with us as we dive into the sensationalism surrounding the Hatfield and McCoy feud. All aboard the Kentucky-Tennessee Living Time Machine. Please fasten your seatbelts and keep your arms and legs inside of the vehicle at all times. But to get going, we need your help. We still need to fire up that time machine to transport us. Please help us by clicking on the like, subscribe, and bell notification buttons down below. Not only does this fire up the time machine for our flight back in time, but it convinces the YouTube algorithm that we need a bigger vehicle to reach more people who love history as much as you do. Now, back to our story. The reading of the article. Hold on. The article we are about to read contains a lot of mistruths about the Hatfield and McCoy feud. As we go through this chapter by chapter, we will address everything. Here we go. Remember to breathe as I had to. Quote, A Mountain Feud, a remarkable story of murder and outrage. The Hatfield and McCoy War. It began over 2 razorback hogs. Renewed by the acts of a wayward girl. The guilty not brought to trial. On the contrary, Governor Buckner of Kentucky and Governor Wilson of West Virginia refused to give up acknowledged criminals. The few, who are awaiting trial, were kidnapped. 12 men flee from one. A wife's singular method of entrapping her husband's enemy. Mountain notions of morals, murders to come. A mountaineer, ornamental, and truthful motto. Logan Courthouse, Logan County, West Virginia, October 2nd. Today, the case of the state against Dave Staton, John Norman, John B. Dodson, and Joseph Franklin Smith, all citizens of Pike County, Kentucky, charged with aiding and abetting in the murder of Bill Dempsey, a special deputy sheriff of this county, at the mouth of Grapevine Creek on Tug River in January last, will be called for trial. The murder of Dempsey was the 10th committed in what is known in this county as the Hatfield-McCoy War. The murders are all done in the most cowardly fashion. And in one case, an innocent woman was deliberately shot through the heart while begging with clasped hands and streaming eyes for her life. Besides those killed, 10 have been wounded, including 2 women, who have been crippled for life and whose lives have been shortened by their sufferings. One of those murdered was a lad of 13 who was compelled to see 2 older brothers shot to death before his very own sufferings were ended. In spite of the atrocity of the crimes committed, neither Governor Wilson of West Virginia nor Governor Buckner of Kentucky will issue a requisition for the transportation of even the acknowledged criminals from one state to the other. The people of the North have read short sketches of the incidents of the deadly feuds between Southern families. Here is the story in detail of such a feud from its beginning to the present time." Unquote. The truth about the Battle of Grapevine Creek. The article begins with a trial of 4 men who were being tried for the aiding and abetting in the murder of Bill Dempsey. This happened after the Battle of Grapevine Creek in 1888, but as we shall see, not all is as it seems written in the article. The beginning of the battle started when Deputy Sheriff Bad Frank Phillips and his posse, that included Bud McCoy and one of Randall's sons, James Jim McCoy, were commissioned by the Kentucky State Governor, Simon Buckner, to begin tracking Ance Hatfield and his group of men across the border into West Virginia. On January 10th, Phillips arrested Cap Hatfield. Jim Vance was the first to die, as he was killed resisting arrest in a wooded area. There are several who claim that Vance was killed after the party, which included several McCoys, was ran down in the woods. Still others claim that Phillips took the law into his own hands and killed Vance himself. In several raids, Phillips was able to capture more conspirators, and 3 Hatfield supporters were killed in the attempts. On January 19, 1888, Deputy Sheriff Frank Phillips and his posse found Ance Hatfield and the other Hatfield men waiting upon them at Grapevine Creek. The largest gun battle of the feud began, which has made the feud legendary, but the Hatfields were eventually rounded up and arrested. Deputy Bill Dempsey, who was a Hatfield supporter and possibly the nephew of Jim Vance, was wounded and executed by Deputy Sheriff Frank Phillips on the scene after the Hatfields had surrendered. This battle claimed more than a dozen lives from both sides of the feud. So, we have a question. Why were Dave Stratton, John Norman, John B. Dodson, and Joseph Franklin Smith charged with the crimes if Deputy Sheriff Frank Phillips had committed the murder of Dempsey? The woman begging for her life. I have searched for the other 2 women who was killed and severely wounded by this feud. I could only find the direct death of a woman through the story of Ellison McCoy. There are references to a second woman, but we could not find her name unless everyone is referring to the death of Sarah McCoy. I also could not find the wounding of the other woman in question. This may change as the story progresses, but for now I have not been able to find the references of these 2 missing ladies. The only references we have concerning a woman crying and begging for the life of her children is that of Sarah McCoy in her own testimony before the court. In her own statement, she says the following, quote, "I am the mother of Tolbert, Farmer, and Randolph McCoy. They are dead. Wall had a double-barrel shotgun laying across his lap. I was talking, praying, and crying for my boys. I heard Wall say that if Ellison Hatfield died, he would shoot the boys as full of holes as a sifter bottom. I fell on my knees and began praying, begging, and crying for my children." Unquote. The woman who was shot through the heart, according to the article, was Ellison McCoy. From everything I could find, Ellison suffered and was crippled by a bout of polio when she was a young child. When the McCoy cabin was set on fire on January 1st, 1888, She, along with several other McCoy children, were trying to put out the flames. When she went out to retrieve more water from the well, that is when she was shot. It is unclear from all of the stories we could find of her if she was shot in the heart or not. We also have not been able to find where she begged for her life. She was only 29 years old at the time of her death. Her mother, Sarah, was brutally beaten by Jim Vance and Johnson Hatfield when she tried to lend help to her dying daughter. According to the Hatfields and McCoy's by Otis K. Rice, Sarah had begged to be allowed to tend her dying daughter, to which she was severely beaten in the head with a gun butt by Johnson Hatfield. Depending upon the source used, Sarah suffered a skull fracture or a crushed skull, her arm and hip were broken, and several ribs were also counted in the injuries. Sarah almost died of her injuries and would live out the rest of her life being disabled from the injuries she sustained that night. She would die in 1890, just 2 years after this event. The lad who was shot. We will delve deeper into the story of Calvin Cal McCoy when we reach Chapter 2 of this story. However, he indeed did meet his death when the McCoy cabin was burned to the ground. Evidently, when the house was set on fire to flush out the McCoys, Calvin grabbed his gun and ran out of the cabin to defend his family. He was shot immediately as he passed through the doorway. Calvin was 25 or 26 years old when he died. The state's refusal. Despite what the article has stated, there were arrest warrants that were issued for the crimes committed. In fact, Governor Buckner and Governor Wilson almost threw Kentucky and West Virginia into another civil war because of this feud. Kentucky Governor Simon B. Buckner sent his Adjutant General Sam Hill to Pike County to investigate how the situation could be calmed. West Virginia State Governor E. Willis Wilson demanded that the men be returned to the state of West Virginia as their capture was deemed illegal and not recognized by the state. Wilson sued the state of Kentucky for the illegal arrest and the 9 prisoners being held in Pike County and demanded reparations for the raids into the state of West Virginia. Wilson also sent troops to the border of West Virginia to prevent further raids from across Tug River. In response, Buckner sent troops to the Kentucky border to prevent further retaliatory raids by either the troops or the Hatfields against the McCoys. In only 20 years since the Civil War, once again the troops from 2 states were facing one another. First, the reading of the Sun article. Quote, the first murder. The trouble all began over 2 long-nosed, razor-backed, elm-peeler hogs. Randolph McCoy, known as Old Randall, is the head of the McCoy faction, and Anderson Hatfield, commonly called Bad Ants, is the head of the Hatfields. McCoy lived on Blackberry Branch of Pond Creek in Pike County, and Ants on the Logan side of the Tug River. Both men had a number of brothers, and every one of each family had just as many children as the laws of nature would permit. One of Ant's brothers, Floyd by name, lived in Kentucky near Randolph McCoy. The McCoy brothers say that Floyd Hatfield, quote, took up, unquote, 2 hogs that belonged to their father, Randolph McCoy. The Hatfields say that old Randolph took off with 2 belonging to Floyd Hatfield. And the chances are, from what Randolph's own neighbors and friends tell of him, that he was the aggressor. The case came on for trial before Justice of the Peace Matthew Hatfield. And Floyd Hatfield had several witnesses who swore positively to the identity of the hogs, which were there present in court, tethered under a big beech tree near the house of the justice. Randolph McCoy could bring no witnesses and, of course, lost his suit and was obliged to pay costs. He went home very much disgruntled, but did nothing worse than talking for a couple of years. a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Randolph McCoy. However, Randolph's talk eventually brought on bloodshed. Among the witnesses in the suit over the hogs was old Bill Staton. Bill was a brother of Floyd Hatfield's wife. It happened one day that Floyd Hatfield, Deacon Ellison Hatfield, Floyd's brother, young Bill Staton, and several other members of the Hatfield family were drawing a seine in Tug River for fish, when Randolph McCoy and two of his boys came along. Randolph got talking about the two hogs, and the Hatfields talked back. And in the end, Randolph said that old Bill Staton had deliberately perjured himself at the trial. At this, Bill Staton Jr., who was a boy of about 18 years, picked up a stone and threw it at Randolph with such good aim that he knocked the old man down. Thereupon, the McCoy boys jumped on young Bill and would have made short work of him had not Deacon Ellison Hatfield interfered. Within 6 months, young Bill Staton was shot dead in the road on one of the Pike County creeks. He was waylaid by Parrish and Sam McCoy, nephews of Randolph. They were young men who had been persuaded into making trouble for young Bill by their uncle Randolph, the Hatfields say. They were arrested, tried, and acquitted for lack of evidence. The absolute acquittal of the two McCoy boys made the Hatfields mad, as they say in the country. They concluded that there was no West Virginian that could get justice in a Kentucky court in a capital case. At a subsequent election held in Pike County, at which the Hatfields from West Virginia were present as workers for relatives living on the Kentucky side, old Randall and his sons and brothers happened to be working for the same person. And the result was that the candidate got the two families together over a jug of moonshine whiskey. There was just enough of the whiskey to make everyone mellow, and not enough to make anyone ugly, and so the two families made peace and lived comfortably for several years thereafter. Had it not been for an entirely new cause of trouble, no blood save that of poor Bill Staton would, in all probability, have been shed." Unquote. Why fight over a pig? A little something about how pigs and hogs are viewed in the Appalachian Mountains. They are their own food group. Just about every meal has some pork in it somewhere. It's just the way it is. The main reason this could be is because there is very little grazing ground for cows and cattle to be raised. Some cows were raised in mountains, but a lack of land made it impossible for everyone to raise them. Chickens and pork was usually the meat that would be raised fairly easily and didn't take up much farm room to have. The hogs were often slaughtered in the fall of the year, and the meat hung to dry in a smokehouse over the winter so they can be used as needed. Usually this meat was bacon or ham. Think of a smokehouse as a place that the meat could be stored while it was curing, as refrigeration was not feasible yet in the mountains. Smokehouses were made from brick, lumber, or even carved out of the side of a mountain. They had a door and a vent in them. Inside was a stove used for smoking the meat and racks that held the meat to be cured. The door almost always had a padlock on it because the meat was so valuable. To steal a pig or to kill one was a serious offense because you were basically stealing from the table of a family. One hog can feed a family for most of the winter months. If a pig or the meat in the smokehouse was stolen, then there was potential for a family to starve to death during the winter months. The controversy of the pig trial. Now, this is one of the more controversial parts of the Hatfield and McCoy feud. The reason being that even though this is part of the myth and mystique of the feud, it seems that there is some question if this event even took place. There are no court records, no arrest record for Floyd Hatfield, or any solid evidence for this event. If the Sun is correct, there really wouldn't be. After all, if this trial took place in the backyard of the Justice of the Peace to settle this argument, then there would be no reason to make it a part of public record. But because this would have been a conflict between the families, and there is no record, it leaves everyone with the question, did it really take place? We believe that it did. Neighbors often have conflicts, and some of them need legal action to settle the situation. Both sides went to the justice to have the matter settled. It is not the fault of the McCoys nor the Hatfields that the justice failed to record the matter in a legal document. Justice of the Peace clarification. Evidently, there were several justices of the peace in the area. Three names that had been given by different sources as the man who heard this trial was Valentine Hatfield, Matthew Hatfield, and Anderson Preacher Ants Hatfield. This is very important because there are sources that simply list the person over the case as Justice Hatfield. From the majority of sources that we could find, Valentine Wall Hatfield had nothing to do with the hog case. We took this opportunity to look at all three men who were the possible justice of the peace in the case. We are in no way saying that this event did not take place. We are currently in the understanding that it did to explain the death of Bill Staton. However, there might be enough evidence that another unnamed Hatfield served in this manner and held the court case before them. We looked up Preacher Ants because his name is closely associated with devil ants. It seems that Reverend or Preacher Anderson Hatfield was the son of Andrew Hatfield and Susan Trent Hatfield. Preacher Ants would have been a cousin to devil ants, but this was not all we found. It seems, according to the article, quote, The Hatfields of Blackberry Creek, unquote, written by Thomas Dodson, source in the description box. Preacher Ants was not a justice of the peace during the hog trial. To quote his article, quote, at the time of the purported pig trial, which never happened, Preacher Ants did not live in the house where the market now stands. The preacher was living at Blue Spring in 1878 and was not the justice of the peace at that time, unquote. Okay, so Dodson does not believe that a pig trial took place at all. But it is interesting that the author does say that Preacher Ants did not even live in the area at that time. But let's go back to the other source that states that Matthew Hatfield was the justice of the peace of the case. Matthew Ellison Matt Hatfield was a Pike County constable during the Hatfield and McCoy feud. He was the son of Ephraim Hatfield and Phoebe Easter Vance Hatfield. If this is correct, Matthew Hatfield could not have been justice of the peace that is spoken about in the trial either. So, what about the sources that state that Valentine Wall Hatfield heard this trial? It seems that there is no substantial evidence for this either. Currently, we could not find the date that Hatfield became a justice of the peace. So, for now, we have to discount him as a potential justice in this matter. All we can say is, if neither of the men listed heard the trial, who did? It is now a question we leave to further evidence coming to light as time marches on. The previous problems with Bill Staton's story. The first problem we had with Staton was over his photograph. It seems that the source material that we used was incorrect with the labeling of the photograph with Bill Staton's name on it. The picture may have actually been Ants Hatfield, and it got confused in a shuffle. That often happens with different pictures over time. Because this is the only photograph that has been labeled with his name that we could find, we have decided to place an oval over his face with a question mark for placekeeping purposes. This is not the only issue we have with Bill Staton. It seems that his whole identity is now in question. We will discuss this further in this video. Our next issue with Bill Staton came while we were writing up the first part of this section of the story. We fell down a rabbit hole with his life and death. We will convey all of the information that we could find out about Bill Staton and if he really died because of the testimony he gave during the hog trial or for another reason entirely. The multiple identities of Bill Staton. We have found a huge issue. First of all, there is not much information about Bill Staton, old Bill Staton or Bill Staton Jr. online. However, we do find reference to all three names being used in the story. So we have to ask, was this all one man or three different men? And if they were three different men, why was Bill Staton Jr. the one killed in the Sun article, if old Bill Staton was the one that testified? Conversely, if Bill Staton Jr. was the one that testified, why was old Bill Staton called a liar over the trial statements? We have run into this very same problem when we started the Pound Gap Massacre series. It took us several months to untangle who the real Jane Mullins really was. Now it seems we have this very same issue with Bill Staton. Who was he? Where did he come from? And is someone trying to hide something by confusing his true identity? We are not victim blaming here, but asking real questions about why Bill Staton's identity seems to be hidden on purpose. Over apparently three different people. We did find a family scandal with a Bill Staton, but not for certain which Bill Staton that this involved, and if it was the true reason behind his death. Charges of adultery. Now we found online an article titled Bill Staton Killed by Sam McCoy. Links down below. It seems that Bill was having an adulterous affair with Martha McCoy, who was a cousin to Sam and Parrish McCoy. This was a huge scandal, as it was brought before the court in the case called Commonwealth versus William Staton and Martha McCoy. The charge was adultery. Thanks to the website, there is a photograph of the document concerning this case. It seems that bench warrants were sworn out for Bill Staton and Martha McCoy. Bill lived on the West Virginia side and Martha on the Kentucky side of the Tug River. Martha was forced to face these charges alone, found guilty of adultery, and had to pay a fine of $20. Bill refused to appear in court. The author of this article suggests that this is the true reason for the death of Bill Staton. That the McCoy brothers confronted Staton about not attending court and leaving Martha to defend herself. By doing this, Staton was basically stating that Martha McCoy was a woman of disrepute. Now again, was this the very same Bill Staton that had given the testimony to the hog trial? And could the adultery charges against both him and Martha cause such a huge scandal that the McCoy brothers killed their own kin to stop it? The fishing trip gone awry. First, we need to state that there is no record of the testimony of Bill Staton. According to the legend of the feud, that during the trial, Staton gave testimony that acquitted Floyd Hatfield for theft of a hog. And, according to the Sun, evidently Randolph McCoy was mad enough about it that he called Staton a liar to his face. But the article also leaves us with another question. Was Bill Staton killed for the testimony or for the events that took place at the fishing hole? From the article, we have now that question, as the Sun states that it was Bill Staton Jr. that was murdered, not old man Bill Staton. If it was Bill Staton Jr., then he would have been killed for throwing rocks at Randolph McCoy or participating in an argument with him over old man Bill Staton. The legend of the feud states that it was old man Bill Staton that died. After speaking about the trial with the Hatfields at the fishing hole, Randolph McCoy stated that Bill Staton had perjured himself deliberately. This upset Bill Staton Jr., who threw rocks at McCoy. Staton knocked McCoy down, and the McCoy sons started to beat up Staton. Deacon Ellison Hatfield broke up the fight. Now, we had some doubts concerning the details of this fight until we came across the article found in the Hatfield McCoy Foundation and Museum. While more details are found in the Sun than at the museum website, it does seem that there is a bit of truth in when old man Bill Staton died. It seems that Bill Staton died on June 18, 1880. But again, we have to ask, which Bill Staton? We tried to look up records concerning the death of Bill Staton and could not find anything. But we do have questions about the fight that the Sun states that happened at the fishing hole. Why did Deacon Ellison Hatfield break up the fight? Why did Bill Staton Jr. stone Randolph McCoy? And did this event have a direct cause for the death of old man Bill Staton or Bill Staton Jr.? It seems that Parrish and Sam McCoy did face a trial over the death of Bill Staton and was acquitted for self-defense reasons. Did Parrish and Sam McCoy have an argument with old man Bill Staton over the trial that led to his death? Or did Bill Staton attack the two McCoy brothers for calling him a liar? We simply will not know for sure. Now, according to the article, the death of Bill Staton brought peace to Tug Valley for several years. This was not so. According to the Hatfield and McCoy Museum, Rosanna McCoy ran off with Johnson Hatfield that very same year, and there was an arrest or kidnap of Johnson Hatfield that took place. 2 years later, the murder of Ellison Hatfield and the three McCoy brothers would take place in 1882. Now, we must ask you, our viewer, these questions. Do you believe that the conflict of the hog took place or not? Do you think that this conflict led to the death of old man Bill Staton or Bill Staton Jr.? Let us know in the comment section down below. The reading of the Sun article, Chapter 2, A Wayward Girl. Quote, Chapter 2, A Wayward Girl. This time, a wayward girl was at the bottom of the trouble. Pretty Roseanne McCoy, a daughter of old Randall, loved stalwart Johnson Hatfield, a son of bad aunts. Roseanne was 20 years old, and Johnson, now known only as Johnsy, was 18. Roseanne was old enough to know better, but she allowed Johnsy to persuade her that a marriage tie was in no way necessary to the consummation of love. The girl's father and brothers knew that she occasionally met Johnsy, but they supposed that it was an innocent courtship. The knowledge of the truth came to them somewhat rudely. Johnsy was an outlaw in Kentucky. He had been indicted at that time, although but 18 years old, 27 times. The crimes, however, were not venial in either Kentucky or West Virginia eyes. He had merely made the practice of bringing the moonshine whiskey, which his father distilled in the mountains back of his home, over to Kentucky and selling it. He never entered Kentucky except at the risk of his liberty. And it was his bravado in thus avoiding the officers of the law that first attracted Roseanne McCoy. But as the indictments accumulated and the prospects of large fines increased, Sheriff Joe Radcliffe of Pike County became anxious to capture the rascal and offered a reward for his arrest and made Tolbert McCoy, son of old Randall, a deputy. So Tolbert, having secured the warrant, bided his time until his sister Roseanne made her usual excuse about going to see a neighbor down on Pond Creek. Tolbert knew that the neighbor was none other than Johnsy. After Roseanne had gone, Tolbert and his brother Farmer followed at a proper distance, and finally saw her leave the Pond Creek Road and go up a dry bed of a small waterway in this country called a drain. They went up the mountain and very cautiously descended the drain, until, on turning a clump of bushes, they surprised their sister with her lover. In the eyes of the mountain folks along Tug River, this sight was enough to make the boys right mad, but it was not a case for blood. As for Roseanne, she cut around the mountain to the house of a friend, where she borrowed a mule, and mounting it bareback, she rode at full gallop to the river, which she forded, and then ran the mule to Aunt Hatfield's house, Johnsy's home, and told what had happened to Johnsy. It took but half an hour for Ants to gather the few neighbors and his own sons, and with guns and pistols loaded, started to rescue Johnsy. This arrest and the following rescue occurred in 1880. At the home of old Randall in Pikeville is a bright boy of 7. He bears the name of McCoy after his mother Roseanne. His father was Johnsy Hatfield. In the flight on last New Year's night, in which the house of old Randall was burned and his son and daughter were shot, this boy escaped death at the hands of his father by the thickness of a piece of muslin. Roseanne, after alarming the Hatfields in order that Johnsy may be rescued, did not dare to return home, and so remained in the family of bad aunts, living as the mistress of Johnsy, without protest on the part of even Johnsy's mother. Johnsy and the girl slept in a bed in the same room with the old folks and several members of the family. It is the custom of the country. Within a year, however, Johnsy, who was a surly brute, turned her and her child, who was born in Virginia, away, and she has since lived with her father and mother. Quote, "There were no open hostilities, even on her return," unquote, said a lawyer in Pikeville who was familiar with the story. Quote, "But of course the McCoys were mad," unquote. The fact is, during the year of 1881 and the first half of 1882, the McCoys and the Hatfields kept away from each other. Unquote. The romance begins. It is not really known the date that Rosanna McCoy, Randolph McCoy's daughter, entered a relationship with Devil Ance's son, Johnson, also known as Johnsy. However, it is also speculated that they met at an election day gathering in 1880 on Blackberry Creek in Pike County, Kentucky. A word about election days in Kentucky. Back in the 1880s, this was considered to be a great gathering of people. It was treated more of a social gathering than an election that we think of today. It was a time for everyone to get to know those that were running for office in their local districts and meet them face to face. It was not unheard of for them to have an informal family reunion at this time. Also, it was a time that young people could see each other, and a lot of romances and potential marriages would come out of election days back then. There are several newspaper accounts and versions of this story that Rosanna would sneak off from the McCoy home under the pretext that she was visiting a neighbor to see Johnson Hatfield. When this romance was first discovered, it was believed that it was simply a courtship, that it had not turned physical yet. This would turn out to be much more than the McCoys realized. All we know for certain is that before 1881, she had left the McCoy family household to live with the Hatfields in West Virginia. According to history, Randolph was not thrilled by Rosanna's actions, as she did this without either his knowledge or consent. Neither of the families would consent to the match. Common law marriage? Now, something for everyone who is not from the Appalachian Mountains should know. A couple can be wed without a marriage license. This still goes on all of the time in the mountains to this day. Common law marriages are a real recognized part of life in the mountains. This goes back to the time of circuit preachers, when you might see a preacher once a month or every 6 months, depending on the time of year and weather. Another form of common law marriage is that a couple may be legally divorced, but still living together. All of the children born under this arrangement are often considered to be legitimate, and the children do bear the father's last name in many cases. A person who is common law married can be divorced from someone by simply moving out of the house. This again goes to the common law marriage idea, and if a couple breaks up, they separate and go their own ways. They also publicly declare that they are no longer a couple, and this is recognized as their divorce. In a common law marriage, both parties have to recognize that they are in this arrangement. They have to publicly declare to each other as husband and wife, sometimes in a small ceremony, and this is where this part of the feud takes shape. Were they or weren't they married under these rules? It seems that there may have been some debate over this idea. Kentucky does recognize common law marriages, but West Virginia does not. Knowing this, it adds a whole new dimension to the romance and the feud. The newspaper, The Sun, does allude to the idea that the relationship between Rosanna McCoy and Johnson Hatfield could have been a common law marriage, if it had been recognized at all by the two states. However, the question does remain, were the two married in a common law marriage, Or was this simply a woman who loved and trusted a man too much and was left out in the cold? Moonshining. We talked briefly about moonshining in our video about Valentine Hatfield, but this bears repeating as it goes to set up why Johnson Hatfield was arrested for the crime of bootlegging. There is a wonderful quote in the movie Coal Miner's Daughter given by Lee Dollarhide. Quote, "If you're born in Kentucky, you've got three choices: coal mine, moonshine, or moving on down the line." Unquote. This quote can also be given to just about anywhere in the Appalachian Mountains. But in the case of the Hatfields in 1880, there were no major coal mines in the area yet. So the choices here would have been timber, moonshine, or down the line. Let's talk about moonshine for just a moment. Almost everyone knows that it is illegal whiskey that is made in the mountains and goes by several different names. Usually it is distributed at night and sometimes taken across state lines. The charge for this is called bootlegging. As such was the case for Johnson Hatfield, who would transport the moonshine from West Virginia into Kentucky. Now, other than this being illegal, why would this cause trouble between the two families? Simply put, both families were competing for the same market. This would involve the manufacturing, distribution, and sale of moonshine. It is thought, since they were competitors, that this would also contribute to the anger in both families against each other. We see this go on today with gangs or mob families. When Johnson was 18 years old, he stayed into trouble with a newspaper report saying that he had been indicted 27 times for transporting moonshine whiskey for sale. Pike County, Kentucky Sheriff Joe Radcliffe deputized Tolbert McCoy to help bring in Johnson Hatfield. The McCoy family had Johnson arrested or kidnapped, depending upon whose side you are with, on the outstanding Kentucky bootlegging charge against him. This was thwarted by Rosanna McCoy, which we will get into shortly. But it goes to show that Johnson Hatfield never faced trial or jail time for his illegal actions concerning bootlegging. Rosanna's ride to rescue Johnson. How the following event takes place goes according to which historian is relating the tale. It is unclear if this takes place when Rosanna takes up with Johnson for the first time and they were in the bushes together, or if they had a fight and she was at the McCoy home and heard her family bragging that they had captured Johnson and was bringing him in for bootlegging, or if this event took place after Johnson had thrown out Rosanna after she was pregnant and had married Nancy. We have seen all these possibilities in our sources. First, we will cover the events that are undisputed. First, we know that Rosanna got on a horse or a mule, again depending on the source used, and rode to the Hatfield home in the middle of the night. She alerted Anderson Ance Hatfield, who was the father of Johnson, that he was under arrest, that her family, the McCoys, had Johnson brought in under the charge of bootlegging, and he was being transported to Pikeville, Kentucky to face trial. We also know that Ance Hatfield quickly organized a rescue party and at gunpoint freed Johnson from his captors. The party returned to West Virginia, where Kentucky had no legal authority or standing. Betrayal. Despite this act of love for Johnson and a betrayal to her family, the McCoys, to keep him out of jail, Johnson abandoned Rosanna, who was pregnant with their child. Again, the event of Rosanna's ride could have taken place after he left her alone. It is unknown why the couple actually broke apart. What is clear is that it was a very rocky relationship, as Rosanna eventually left the Hatfields to return to the McCoy family. It seems that Johnson was not exactly faithful to the relationship. Johnson would go on to marry Rosanna's cousin, Nancy McCoy, who was the daughter of Asa Harmon McCoy. Johnson and Nancy legally wed in 1881. What is also kind of interesting about this union was that the marriage to Nancy McCoy was accepted by the Hatfields, whereas the relationship between Johnson and Rosanna was not. Which Rosanna did prove her loyalty to the Hatfield family, so By extension, she might have felt betrayed by them as well. It seems that Johnson was not faithful to his blushing bride either. Nancy divorced Johnson a few years later and wound up marrying Deputy Sheriff Frank Phillips on September 5, 1895. Nancy and Johnson would have 3 children together: Mary Whittle Hatfield, William Anderson Hatfield, and Stella Hatfield. Nancy and Frank would also have 4 children together: Elsie Phillips, Jesse James Phillips, Flora Phillips, and Goda Ethel Phillips Rayburn. Johnson would marry 2 more times. He would marry October 28, 1890 in Pike County, Kentucky, to Rebecca Browning Hatfield. Johnson married a final time sometime around 1900 to Jeanette Frances Brookshire Hatfield. Altogether, Johnson Hatfield would father 8 children. The children's names were Sarah Elizabeth Hatfield McCoy, Mary Whittle Hatfield, William Anderson Hatfield, Stella Hatfield, Midgie Hatfield Kent, Moss F. Hatfield, Levista Edna Hatfield Fields, and Robert Luther Hatfield. The birth of Sarah Elizabeth Hatfield McCoy. It seems that Rosanna also had a rocky relationship with her family as well. Besides the fact that she betrayed them for the love of a man that the family did not approve of, she came home pregnant with an illegitimate child. This was a huge shame during the late 1800s in the mountains. The family would have 3 choices in how to handle this matter. The first choice would be to marry Rosanna quickly to someone else to have the child given a respectable name. The second choice would be to allow Rosanna and her child to remain with the family and deal with the community shame. And the third choice would be to send Rosanna away to live with a relative in another town. The child of Johnson and Rosanna would be born in the spring of 1881 and named Sarah Elizabeth Hatfield McCoy. She would die at the age of 8 months old of the measles. It is said that Randolph McCoy refused to recognize the child of Rosanna and Johnson, and also he refused to speak to his daughter ever again. So her mother, Sarah, arranged for her to live with her Aunt Betty in Springfield, Kentucky. Who was the 7-year-old unnamed boy? So we can see that there was no 7-year-old boy born to Johnson and Rosanna during the time that is given in the Sun newspaper. For that child to have existed between the 2 lovers, Rosanna would have to be 12 to 13 years old when she gave birth to him. Johnson would have had to been 10 to 11 years old when he fathered the child. Now, this is not to say that a union couldn't have been possible, and marriages back then did take place during those age ranges. However, this would have been impossible in this case because the 2 supposedly did not meet until they were 18 years old for Johnson and 20 years old for Rosanna. Rosanna died at the age of 29 to 31 years old. Her gravestone is unclear of the year, and a grave marker says that Rosanna died of grief and lost her will to live. She never saw Johnson again. In the next point about the 7-year-old son, Rosanna McCoy and her child were in Springfield, Kentucky. They were nowhere near the McCoy home when it was burned to the ground. There was a shooting of a McCoy son, but he was much older. Evidently, when the house was set on fire to flush out the McCoys, Calvin McCoy grabbed his gun and ran out of the cabin to defend his family. He was shot immediately by the Hatfields as he passed through the doorway. Calvin McCoy was 25 or 26 years old when he died. In this case, the newspaper report got their story skewed, in our opinion. We do have a question about this event. We have often wondered why there were charges brought against the Hatfields for the murder of Alifair McCoy and not Calvin McCoy. We can only surmise that Calvin was coming out of the house armed and ready to defend his family, and the Hatfields claimed that his death was by self-defense, and so the district attorney agreed with them. We simply do not know for sure. All we know is that Calvin's death is rarely reported. If the story is reported, then the death of Calvin is a footnote or is misreported. Untruths. There are a couple of untruths that have been recently coming out about Rosanna McCoy, and we feel this is a good time to address them. There is zero evidence that she loved or was with anyone else but Johnson Hatfield. There is a miniseries that did link her with Perry Anderson Klein after the breakup, but he was married and the affair was unlikely. There is currently no evidence in documents, the feud legend, nor newspaper reports that back up this affair, so it must be discounted. That is the danger with dramatizations. They try to add to the story to make it more dramatic, when the truth of the matter is enough. And basically, Rosanna would not have had the time. Either while she was pregnant or shortly after she gave birth, Rosanna McCoy was sent out of the area to Springfield, Kentucky, and later she moved to Ashford, Kentucky. There is also another point we need to address. There is evidence that the breakup between Rosanna and Johnson was one of the causes behind the death of Ellison Hatfield. There may have been other causes behind it as well. To say that it was the only reason would be an atrocity. But we will get into the murder in a future video. The reading of the article. Once again, we suggest this portion of the video should not be heard by children. It is very violent in nature. Quote, Chapter 3. Deacon Ellison Hatfield murdered and his death avenged. At the August election in 1882 in Pike County, Mr. Thomas Stafford was the candidate of the Democratic Party for Justice of the Peace. Stafford was a brother-in-law of Elias, Valentine, Ellison, and Bad Ants Hatfield. He was also related by marriage to the McCoy's. To ensure Stafford's election, the Hatfield brothers came over to Kentucky to use their influence on friends and acquaintances. The McCoys also turned out to aid Mr. Stafford. But, as in the former reconciliation, the angel of peace was perched on the shoulders of the Democratic candidate, and she had a jug containing just the right quantity of moonshine in her hand. She held the jug to the lips of the Hatfields and the McCoys with impartial hand. And before noon had arrived, past difficulties were forgotten, and the boom for Stafford had swelled to magnificent proportions. All doubts of his election by a handsome majority were gone. It was an occasion to be celebrated by both Hatfields and McCoys. To celebrate it, they sent for more moonshine. Joe Davis kept a big supply of it at the mouth of Blackberry Creek, half a mile or so from where the election was held. Messengers were sent down to Joe's for whiskey. It was brought in bottles. Part of it was apple moonshine and part was corn. It is said regretfully now, by those who were present, that Joe Davis ought never to have sold both apple and corn moonshine, for the mixture always did and always will provoke men to wrath. Those who try the mixture for the first time say they do not doubt nor wonder at this statement. However, it happened between drinks Talbot McCoy met with Elias Hatfield, who is known as Bad Lias, to distinguish him from his uncle Elias, the brother of Aunts Valentine and Floyd, his father. Bad Lias had once borrowed $1.75 cash from Talbot McCoy, and had failed to return it as promised. Tolbert wanted the money to buy moonshine with and asked for it. Lias declared that he did not owe Tolbert a cent. Tolbert jumped on him to pound him into paying the money. Tolbert was a stalwart for a Kentucky mountaineer and was rapidly beating Lias into submission when Ellison and Elias, the boys' uncles, came up. Elias had a revolver in his hand and Ellison a pocket knife of large size, with the blade open. Farmer McCoy also drew a pistol. Seeing them coming, Constable Matthew Hatfield, a Pike County officer distantly related to the Virginia Hatfields, arrested Tolbert McCoy and took him to one side, while another constable arrested Bad Lias. Unfortunately for all concerned, the mixture of the two kinds of moonshine had worked on the mind of the good Deacon Ellison Hatfield, that he was not now a peacemaker, as he had tried to be on a former occasion. Instead, he was dead in earnest in seeking for a fight. He reckoned the McCoys had come there for a fight, and he was ready to accommodate them. The biggest of the McCoys had picked on little Elias, and nobody but a coward would do that. If the big McCoy was a man, he wouldn't stand there pretending that the constable was holding him, but would jump out and show what he could do with a man after making a beginning on a boy. With each sentence, the deacon got more excited and waved his knife closer to the body of Tolbert McCoy. Seeing that Tolbert was likely to be stabbed unless released, for on account of the pressure of the crowd about them, Constable Matthew Hatfield was unable to get his prisoner away. The constable released McCoy. The moment he felt himself free, Tolbert leaped back 2 jumps in the open ring that the eager mountaineers had formed, and drew a pocket knife much like that held by the deacon. Then the 2 men sprang at each other on murder intent, while the crowd around surged and waved to and fro as each of the spectators strove to see every move that was made. The 2 men met with a thud, and Tolbert sank his knife into Deacon's side, missing a fatal wound only because the point of the blade struck a rib and glanced. The deacon gashed his opponent over the head, cutting through the soft felt hat and clear to the skull from the left ear over the top of the forehead, directly above the nose. Then the 2 men separated by a step each, and here and there in a ring of spectators, knives and revolvers appeared. In a moment, the combatants came together again, and Ellison Hatfield's blade crossed his hand, cutting it till he dropped the knife and started to clean out Tolbert with his fists. He was more powerful man than even Tolbert, or at least better as a wrestler, and was soon getting the best of the fight. But Tolbert was quick with the knife as an Italian desperado, and plunged it repeatedly into Deacon's sides and hips. Some of the wounds were deadly, but in the heat of the fight, the deacon apparently did not notice them. It is alleged by the Hatfields that 2 of the McCoys helped Tolbert by giving Ellison a sly stab as the 2 fighters surged first against one side of the ring of spectators and then against another. Even little Bud McCoy, a lad of 9, is said to have stabbed Ellison twice in the legs, although Randolph Jr., a lad of 13, was arrested for it at the time. The McCoys say that under like circumstances a Hatfield kicked Tolbert in the knees, and thus it happened that Tolbert fell with Ellison on top. As Tolbert's head struck the ground, Ellison grabbed a jagged stone in lieu of the knife that he had lost, and raising it on high, was about to crush the skull of his prostrate enemy, when Farmer McCoy, unable longer to restrain himself, fired his revolver full at Ellison's back. The bullet struck Deacon just above the right suspender button, and ranged forward and upward, and he fell over, unable to continue the fight. Farmer McCoy dropped his pistol and fled up the road, while Elias opened fire with the pistol he had all the time carried in his hand. Farmer increased his pace as Elias fired, and all 5 chambers of the revolver were emptied in vain. Then Elias dropped his pistol and started after the fugitive, together with Constable Matthew Hatfield. Farmer was overtaken after a race of only about 200 yards and brought back to the big breech tree where the voting had been done. The officers of the law had once more asserted themselves. Tolbert and Farmer were both formally arrested, together with Randolph McCoy, Jr., who, with a companion, had been playing at a spring a quarter of a mile away until the firing began, and came running up just as Farmer was being brought back to the polling place. He was accused of cutting Deacon in the legs by a Hatfield who mistook him for the young boy, Bud. This fact is now admitted on all sides, but the McCoys denied that Bud did any stabbing and say that Tolbert did it all. When the McCoys were arrested, they were taken to the house of John Hatfield for the night, as it was by this time late in the afternoon, and there guarded until morning. The deacon was put on a rude stretcher and made with quilts and poles and carried to the mouth of Mate Creek, where he was placed in the house of Henderson. The doctor found 27 cuts in various parts of Deacon's body, including one in the side that split the right lung. The course of the bullet could not be ascertained. The news of the shooting spread along the river and up the creeks and branches on both sides like an autumn fire up the mountainside. And when morning came, there were over 70 of the Hatfield family from West Virginia about the house of John Hatfield on Blackberry Creek, where the prisoners were kept overnight. The majority of the McCoys, following the example set by old Randall himself, flunked. After daylight appeared on Tuesday, the prisoners and their guards ate breakfast and set out for Pikeville jail. They had not traveled over a mile, however, before they met a gang of West Virginia Hatfields, headed by old Bad Ants Hatfield, brother of Ellison. Ance's son, Johnsy, was along. All were armed. Ance said he wanted the boys taken to the mouth of Blackberry Creek for trial, so that the testimony of Dr. Rutherford could be taken without keeping him so long from the side of Ellison, as it would be necessary where the trial was to be held as proposed. The prisoners, as well as the rest concerned, agreed to go to the mouth of Blackberry Creek, except Justice Joseph Hatfield. All ate dinner at Anderson Hatfield's, and then Bad Ants called his party of West Virginians to one side out in the yard. They had a consultation there, after which Bad Ants called out in a loud voice, quote, "All the friends of the Hatfields fall in line, 2 and 2, unquote. About 40 men fell into line, but at the request of Anderson Hatfield, the line was formed outside of his yard. Then Bad Ants called for a rope, and Charlie Carpenter, one of Ants' crowd, brought one from his horse. It had been obtained at the house of Jerry Hatfield, another Kentuckian, by Ants, on his way up Blackberry Creek before he met the prisoners on their way to jail. Carpenter then tied the prisoners together by their arms. When the prisoners had been tied, Carpenter took hold of the end of the line and drove them before him like animals onto a road. Then Bad Ants nodded to Justice Hatfield and said, quote, "We will take charge," unquote. The boys were driven to a ford near where William McCoy lives and across into West Virginia. Then they were driven to a log schoolhouse and there confined under a guard heavily armed. They reached the schoolhouse in the middle of Tuesday afternoon. Here they were first told that they would have a trial on Wednesday afternoon. With Justice Wall Hatfield, who had been a ringleader in kidnapping them from Kentucky, as presiding judge, but all pretense that they were to be tried lawfully was soon thrown aside. Bad Ants settled that as soon as the mother of the prisoners came to the schoolhouse. The mother knelt down before Ants, with hands clasped and a voice choked with sobs, begged him to allow her boys to have a fair trial under the law. Quote, "You needn't beg and you needn't cry," unquote, said Ants. Quote, "If Ellison dies, your boys have got to die. Damn to my heart if they don't," unquote. Tolbert was a married man and had a girl baby 4 months old. The wife came about the time his mother arrived, and she too, with a child in her arms, went on her knees to Ants and to Wall. It was like, in fact, it was nothing less than asking savages not to destroy a hated victim. The treatment of the prisoners during that time that they were kept awaiting the death of Ellison was atrocious. They had been tied together with a heavy rope on Tuesday immediately after dinner, the rope being drawn so tight around their arms as to prevent the circulation of the blood. Not for a moment was this rope loosened or any relief afforded. In addition to the torture of the rope, the prisoners were constantly reminded of their fate by their captors. Justice Wall frequently said to them that prayer to the Almighty was not only a duty, but a pleasure in a time of tribulation, and said it would not hurt them even should Ellison recovery permit them to escape death. The younger Hatfield boys and their friends discussed the points of the human form in which a bullet could produce the greatest pain, and jeered whenever the prisoners said anything. It was half a mile from the schoolhouse to the mouth of the creek where Ellison was dying in Anderson Farrell's house. Messengers passed to and fro frequently. Bad Ants and Wall occasionally visited their brother, while Elias remained with him almost continually. They asked him what should be done with the prisoners in case he died, and he replied, quote, "Give them the civil law," unquote. Finally, at 3 o'clock, the wounded man breathed his last, and Dr. Rutherford told the mountaineers that he was dead. The deacon was a married man and had several children. The widow and the orphans knelt around the bed and wept aloud. And the dead man's brothers, Elias and Ants, who were present, went out into the yard and refused to speak to anyone. A messenger jumped on the mule and rode in a gallop to the schoolhouse with the news. A great cry arose as he shouted, quote, "Ellison done died," unquote. And a number of the guards began running around the schoolhouse and peering through the chinks between the logs to find a place from which they could shoot the prisoners without hitting their own friends. The prisoners, knowing that their fate was determined, broke down and wept, but Tolbert soon recovered his composure and made one last appeal. Quote, "Gentlemen," unquote, he said, quote, "when you shoot me, I want you to look at me in the face. I don't want you to go behind me," unquote. As night came on, Ants mustered the following gang of men: Johnsy Hatfield, Cap Hatfield, both his sons, Valentine and Elias Hatfield, brothers, Charlie Carpenter, Joseph Murphy, Bill Tom Hatfield, Doc Mayhorn, Pliant Mayhorn, Selkirk McCoy and his sons Albert and L.D. Thomas Mitchell, Lark Varney, Andy Varney, Daniel Witt, Sam Mayhorn, Alex Messenger, John Witt, and Ellison Mounts. Having formed them in a line before the schoolhouse, with the sort of military orders he had learned when he was a bushwhacker, he detailed Charlie Carpenter to bring out the prisoners. They were driven along toward Kentucky, with no one saying a word. Farmer and little Randolph McCoy were crying. Sam Simpkins, who kept a store at the mouth of the creek, mate, saw them go by and recognized them in the faint light of the stars. As they entered the water to wade across, Farmer fainted from fear and exhaustion and was dragged across by two of the gang. The lad wept louder than ever, but Tolbert marched erect and in silence, man fashion. At that moment, James McCoy, the brother of the prisoners, stood in the yard of his uncle Asa, a third of a mile up, and on the Virginia side of the river which the gang had just crossed. It was a perfectly quiet night, and he heard the gang cross the river and knew that the end was near. Slipping out, he ran down the river a short distance in the cover of some bushes, but could see nothing, for the Kentucky bank of the river is covered with trees. He waited a few minutes, and then a voice was heard from the Kentucky side, about a quarter of a mile up from where the boys had crossed, which said, quote, "All ready," unquote. Then the voice of Wall Hatfield from the Virginia side was heard saying, quote, "Take aim, fire," unquote. There was a roar of guns and pistols. Jim could see the flashes under the trees distinctly. Several shots were fired under the first volley, and then all was still for 2 minutes. Then came the wail of a boy's voice from under the trees, followed by the heavy report of a double-barreled shotgun. When the gang reached the Kentucky side, they stopped, and by dashing water into Farmer's face, revived him that he might suffer more. Then they forced the prisoners along the grassy bank under the trees until a slight depression was reached. Here were a number of pawpaw trees. The prisoners were there thrown to the ground, and then raised on their knees, and each one tied in that position to a pawpaw bush. Tolbert, who had asked to be shot in the face, was tied with his back to his executioners, but Farmer, who was already nearly dead with fear, was tied facing them. The lad was tied facing his brothers, and then the gang formed in line, and Bad Ants shouted to Wall, who was on the other side of the river, for the word. As it came, they all fired, and the two older brothers, Tolbert and Farmer, fell dead. The crying of the lad had ceased through the horror and fear. After a few shots had been fired into the dead bodies by Cap and John Hatfield, Ellison Mounts, and Tom Mitchell, to gratify their innate thirst for the safe shedding of blood, the gang started down the river. But fear overcame one of their number, Alex Messer, and he said, quote, "Dead men tell no tales," unquote. He referred to the lad who had recognized them all. Quote, "Go you," unquote, said Bad Ants, and Messer loaded his shotgun with rifle balls and, going back, leveled it at the head of the boy. The lad saw him and gave one cry, and then both barrels were fired together. The entire top of the boy's head was blown away, and a piece of his skull 4 inches across was picked up 10 feet away up the sloping bank the next day. His body did not fall, but remained kneeling until cut down by the coroner. As the gang marched back to West Virginia, Justice of the Peace Valentine Hatfield, Wall, met them. Bad Ants formed them in a line facing the justice. Quote, "Hold up your right hands," unquote, said Wall, and all obeyed. Quote, "You and each of you do solemnly swear never to reveal to anyone what has been done this night under the penalty of death, so help you God. Each of you say, 'I do,'" unquote. The men who fired into the McCoy boys were Ants, Cap, and John Hatfield, Charlie Carpenter, Tom Mitchell, Doc Mayhorn, Joe Murphy, Bill Tim Hatfield, Alex Messer, and Ellison Mounts. On Thursday morning, Justice of the Peace Joseph Hatfield, acting as coroner, cut the ropes that bound the bodies to the pawpaws, and a jury of 12 men solemnly inspected the work of the West Virginians, and brought their verdict that the boys had, quote, "come to their deaths by shot wounds at the hands of persons to the jury unknown," unquote. It took nearly half an hour for the coroner and his jury to perform this legal duty. Then Jim McCoy and his brother Sam and the Justice of the Peace carried the bodies up the hillside a few rods to the road and placed them on a narrow sled drawn by oxen. While they did this, someone unknown carved with a jackknife into the smooth bark of a big beech tree whose limbs shaded the spot where the tragedy occurred, this inscription with a rude border around it. Quote, "The McCoy boys, shot in 1882, unquote. The funeral was held that afternoon at the home of Old Randolph, near the head of the Blackberry Fork upon Creek. More than 1,000 people came, and over 900 horses and mules were, quote, "hanged to the trees and bushes," unquote, up and down the road and about a large yard that surrounded McCoy's house. A wide grave was dug on a small tableland that jutted out from the side of the mountain that rose on the northerly side of the brook opposite Old Randolph's house. Then kindly neighbors placed the bodies in coffins on a litter and carried them across the brook and up the slope to the grave. Here the old mother fell to her knees as the Baptist preacher who conducted the services was about to begin his prayer. and called on God to witness that her pleadings had been listened to on the morning of the election. Neither Ellison nor her boys had suffered cruel and cowardly deaths. Unquote. The undisputed points. There was an election held on August 5th, 1882, and the candidate for office of Justice of the Peace was Thomas Stafford. We could not find a lot of information about Stafford, but it does seem that what we can find, he did have the support from both the McCoy and the Hatfield families. So far, no one has disputed this. We also know that before this point, there had been raids, kidnappings, and lawsuits that caused the families to despise each other. But even though the families did not like each other, they have members that did interact and even employed by the other side of the feud. There is no dispute as to the McCoy brothers Tolbert and Farmer being involved in the conflict. There are some sources that disagree that Randolph Jr. was shot and not Bud. Everywhere we have looked, it seems that it was Bud that was at the pawpaw tree and not Randolph Jr. Another point that is undisputed is that all the people involved in the actual quarrel were in fact drunk on moonshine. We will get into the details of this a little later on, but for now we will say that this part of the tale has never changed. One last undisputed fact would be that Ellison Hatfield was stabbed 26 to 27 times and shot once, depending upon the source used. Even though the timing of his death is disputed, the fact that he died of his wounds is not. The first disputed claim. The first disputed claim we will go over is what the fight was about. In our research, we have found places that there was a disputed loan that was at the center of the conflict. Let's take the son's version of events first. Tolbert lent Elias, Bad Lias, Hatfield $1.75. In today's money, $1.75 would be no big deal and nothing to fight over. It was about the price of a Coca-Cola today, right? But let's look at this in terms of the inflation calculator. According to the CPI inflation calculator, $1.75 in 1882 would be worth $54.10 in October 2024. While in some circles this would not be a lot of money, but if you're not exactly rich and living in the Appalachian Mountains, this was a huge chunk of change. Now, the claim is that Tolbert went to Bad Lias for the return of the money so that he could buy some more moonshine. It seems that Bad Lias had failed to return the money when he said that he would. For Bad Lias to deny that any money was owed to Tolbert would have been a slap in the face. Your word stood as your guarantee in the mountains, and if you did not keep your word, then you were considered to be a lowly person. For this reason, according to the Sun article, Tolbert began his physical fight with Bad Lias. The two men were separated, and Tolbert and Bad Lias were arrested. According to the article, Tolbert was a big man, and Bad Lias was a small man. For this reason, Ellison was not happy, and felt that Tolbert was picking on Bad Lias because of his size, and so the fight was not a fair one. Ellison then decided to goad Tolbert with a knife, even swinging it close to his body. For the safety of Tolbert, who was likely to be stabbed by Ellison, he was released and the two men got into a knife fight. Now, this is very plausible. This was not the first time, nor the last time in history that two men would come to blows over borrowed money. Also, it is plausible that an uncle or other family member would get into a fight to defend their family or a family member, especially if they were drunk on whiskey. The second disputed claim. Now we could see this one running side by side with the first reason for the fight. We can also see this being the sole reason behind the fight as well. Bear in mind that the event of the Election Day conflict took place the very same year that there was trouble between Johnson Hatfield and Rosanna McCoy. One view is that the McCoy brothers were angry about the treatment of their sister Rosanna by the Hatfield family. Johnson Hatfield threw down their sister Rosanna and did marry Rosanna's first cousin Nancy, who was also a McCoy and the daughter of Asa McCoy. However, Rosanna was pregnant at the time of the marriage taking place, so there were understandable hurt feelings about this going on. This alone would be a powder keg ready to explode under the right circumstances. We can also see a scene where there was some dirty name calling where Rosanna was concerned by a drunk Ellison Hatfield. We can also see why equally drunk Tolbert would rise to the occasion to defend his sister. The McCoy honor was now at stake, and it had to be defended. One word would lead to another word, and the next thing you know, the two men were getting physical, and knives and eventually a gun was used. While we are not for sure which or both reasons could have been behind the conflict, both have certainly been claimed by different sources. The third disputed claim. While we are sure that there may be other reasons behind this fight, such as the animosity and other events that happened before the conflict, we will discuss the mixing of the two types of moonshine. Again, going back to the Sun article, it is claimed that Joe Davis provided the moonshine for the Election Day festivities. Election whiskey, wine, beer, hams, turkeys, and other goods were used in order to buy votes in the Appalachians during that time. These goods were handed out to encourage people to vote for the candidate that was handing these things out. Today, this practice is illegal. But going back to the election of 1882, to keep the peace for the two feuding families, moonshine whiskey was handed out. This eventually ran out. But, being a celebration of Stafford winning his election by overwhelming majority, the two sides wanted more moonshine. According to the article, both apple and corn moonshine were offered, and this was an excuse behind the fight. Let's look at this a little closer. According to the scientific study done in 2017, conducted in several countries with both male and female participants, it seems that different types of alcohol does affect your mood. The study states that according to their data, 1/3 of all people who drink whiskey felt that their mood did change to more aggressive, restless, or tearful dispositions. Quote, one of the researchers behind the study, Professor Mark Bells, said, quote, people may rely on alcohol to help them feel a certain way. People might drink to feel more confident or relaxed, but they also risk the negative emotional responses too, unquote. One way to sum up the professor's remarks would be that whiskey is a form of liquid courage that can backfire. As far as the mixing of apple and corn moonshines go, there is a lot of mixed drinks and cocktails out there that do mix a flavored whiskey or other strong alcohol and a plain one, such as made from corn, potatoes, wheat, and rye. It is our opinion that if a person drinks one, then the other, it really would not make a difference other than possibly making the person sick. The election day event would lean more to the amount of alcohol consumed by the group more than what kind of alcohol it was. Add to this that the two factions were already at a quiet war with each other at this point, and it just needed a match to set the whole thing aflame. There is an old saying in the mountains, if you thought it sober, you will do it drunk. And I think in the case of the fight between Tolbert and Ellison, that there was already anger between the two men, and both just needed liquid courage to act upon it. While we will not discuss the actual fight between the Hatfields and McCoys on the election day of August 5th, 1882, we will let it be known that the way the fight is described in the Sun's articles is plausible, but we simply have no other sources that dispute it at this time. This may change, though, as more information becomes available. The age controversy. First, let's get out there the truth of the situation. The Sun's news article was incorrect about the ages of the McCoy brothers. There is also the very interesting fact that we learned about Randolph Jr. and Bud McCoy. The following is the information we could find out about each of the McCoys. Tolbert McCoy was born May 6, 1853. Another source states that his date of birth was June 1st, 1854, in Pike County, Kentucky. According to the Genie website, Tolbert's first wife was Cora Nunnery McCoy. The pair had a son named Luther McCoy, but he is not listed in other places as being the son of Tolbert. He then married Mary Ann Butcher as his second wife on February 3rd, 1881, in Pike County. We also have a listing from the Genie website that Tolbert was also married to Misty McCoy, making her his third and final wife. Tolbert had at least 3 sons and 2 daughters. According to the genealogy search, the often recognized children of Tolbert were Samuel T. McCoy, 1874 to 1959, Tolbert G. McCoy, 1880 to 1956, Cora McCoy, 1882 to 1888, Melvin McCoy, 1882 to 1941, and Laura May McCoy, 1883 to 1957, which means Mary Ann or Misty would have had to have been pregnant with Laura May during the time of the shooting at the pawpaw trees. Tolbert would die on August 9, 1882, at the age of 28 to 29 years old. Farmer McCoy was born in 1863 in Pike County, Kentucky. His death would be recorded also on August 9, 1882. He would have been 18 to 19 years old. Randolph Bud McCoy Jr. was born in 1864 in Pike County, Kentucky, and would die on August 9, 1882. He would have been 17 to 18 years old. According to the article, they had split Randolph Jr. into 2 boys and misaged him by saying that he was either 13 or 9 years old. This was untrue. He was older than the newspaper sensationalized. We can only surmise that this was done not only to sell papers, but to have people take sides in this feud. We have also found in many sources that either Randolph Jr. or Bud are used for the third McCoy brother, that they are never used together to describe the same person. Who was Alexander Messer? One of the more curious of the lesser-known characters of the Hatfield and McCoy feud is that of Alexander Messer. He was born on August 13, 1837 in Perry County, Kentucky. He served on the Union side of the Civil War in the 4th Kentucky Mounted Infantry Company C. He was able to receive a pension for his service during the war and would later use his money for his legal expenses and to support his family. He did ask for an increase of this pension because of his disability and old age. He was known as a Hatfield supporter during the feud. While he was tried for his participation of the execution of the 3 McCoy brothers, he was also tried for being the sole shooter of Randolph Bud McCoy Jr. Messer was tried in Pike County, Kentucky, and sentenced to life in prison. He was paroled in 1906, but violated the terms of his parole a few months later. He was sent back to the prison hospital in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, where he died at the age of 85 years old on June the 24th, 1923. We cannot dispute that he was a participant in the events of August 9, 1882. We also cannot dispute currently that the events as relayed by the Sun article did not take place in the manner that the article described. However, we are disputing whether known facts are not lining up with the author of the article. The controversy over Ellison's death. One of the biggest controversies is, when did Ellison die exactly? Did he die of his injuries at the site of the fight? Did he live for a couple of days after the fight? We tend to agree with those that say that Ellison died a few days after the fight. And here is our logical evidence or proof for this position. If Ellison Hatfield had died on the spot, as some sources propose that he did, then why wait several days to execute the McCoy brothers? If Ellison was deceased, why take him on a stretcher to Mate Creek at the home of Henderson Farrell? Everyone who is involved in the fight would have been immediately arrested and taken to the Pike County Jail. There would have been no doubt who did it, and there would have been no doubt that those involved needed to be jailed. The election had taken place in Kentucky, and it was held not that far from the jailhouse. The Hatfields would not have had a chance to exact their revenge because the brothers would have been sitting in the jail. However, if Ellison Hatfield had survived his injuries long enough to be taken immediately to a doctor for help, then this would explain why the McCoy brothers were taken to the home of John Hatfield on Blackberry Creek. While at the home of John Hatfield, a decision had to be made where and how the McCoy brothers would be arrested and face trial. The home was surrounded by the Hatfield family, and after the guards and the McCoy brothers ate their breakfast, they set out for the Pike County Jail. Now we have to say, this is the worst move that the guards could have ever made. The McCoy brothers should have never been moved under these circumstances. First, there should have been more men guarding the McCoy brothers. Second, the Hatfields should have been cleared out from the area. And third, they should have moved them to the jail immediately after the fight, not to a home where it was less guarded and not safe for the three brothers. Those that were holding and guarding the McCoy brothers should have expected that there would have been a mob to attempt to take their lives. The next thing that helps us with the logical explanation why Ellison did not die immediately was the date of the McCoy deaths on August 9, 1882. This was a full 4 days after the fight. Why wait so long if Ellison had died immediately? But we really have to hand it to Ellison. He had to have been a strong man to live so long with 27 stabs and a gunshot wound. And many of those wounds were considered to be immediately fatal from all that we can find out about them. So the Hatfields kind of sort of knew that Ellison might not pull out of his sickbed. So, in a weird way, this was a death watch. One has to wonder what would have happened to the McCoy brothers if Ellison Hatfield had survived the knife fight. The kidnapping of the McCoy brothers. John Hatfield's home was surrounded by Hatfields. Now, we keep saying that it was the home of John Hatfield because that is what the Sun newspaper reported in its article. However, there are several sources that state that this was actually the home of Floyd Hatfield instead. In the testimony of Sarah McCoy, she states that her sons were held at Floyd's home. So we have to wonder, is this a case where we have a man that has both names that are used for the same person? Could his name have been John Floyd Hatfield or Floyd John Hatfield? So far, we cannot find if this was the case or not. Also, we have the movement of the McCoy brothers to consider here. Suppose that they were initially taken to John Hatfield's home. They ate breakfast, then moved out to head to the Pike County Jail, was taken from their guards, and then taken to Floyd Hatfield's home for the remainder of the time until they held a, quote, trial, unquote, at the schoolhouse. And we use the word trial here very loosely, as there was not an actual trial that took place. Because there is no clarity about this, we will simply say that the three McCoy brothers were being held at a Hatfield home from this moment forward in our story. We have touched on the topic earlier about the kidnapping of the brothers. Now, picture this possibility. You have 3 men bound on horseback with a posse surrounding them to move from Logan County, West Virginia to Pike County, Kentucky. Ellison Hatfield was still alive, but slipping away slowly from his wounds. The Hatfields were angry about the condition of their beloved brother and uncle, and were not about to let those who were responsible slip from their grasp. Ance Hatfield took charge of the situation. Leading his kinfolk into the woods, within a mile of leaving the starting point, the Hatfield party overtook the posse. A very well-armed Hatfield party demanded that the McCoy brothers be taken to Blackberry Creek for trial. According to the Sun article, the excuse was that the testimony of Dr. Rutherford could be taken without him leaving the side of Ellison when he needed him the most. We could not find a conflicting or confirmation source about this situation, so it is plausible that this was the reason that was given, as there was not a gunfight when the McCoy brothers were taken. The treatment of the McCoy brothers. Now, there is not a lot of information out there about how the McCoy brothers were treated before the events at the pawpaw trees, but we can pretty well safely state that the Sun article would have these events pretty well pegged. It would not have been out of the realm of possibilities that they were treated very roughly, that they were tied together so tightly to the point that they could be losing circulation in their hands and feet. Also, the taunting of the three brothers to remind them of what was coming would not be out of the realm of possibilities either. After all, this was about vengeance and justice in the minds of the Hatfields, as well as striking fear into those who dared to cross the Hatfield family. This would have taken place over at least 3 or 4 days, as Ellison Hatfield had not passed away when they were first tied up, and it would take a couple of more days after the event before they were dragged to a place of their deaths at the trees. The meeting. We discussed this part of the story in more detail on our Valentine Hatfield video series. But, for a summary, we will break this part of the feud down into its simplest of explanations. Basically, the Hatfields were waiting to see what was going to happen to Ellison after the knife fight of August 5th, 1882, on Election Day, had taken place. Those under house arrest at the Hatfield home on Blackberry Creek were Tolbert, Farmer, and Randolph Bud McCoy, Jr. Ellison had been stabbed 26 to 27 times and shot. He was recovering at the home of Henderson on Mate Creek. After seeing her sons at the Hatfield home, Sarah McCoy traveled to Mate Creek to a schoolhouse to talk to aunts and Valentine Hatfield about the fate of her sons. Sarah stated that she saw Valentine while Hatfield when she was at Mate Creek, West Virginia. She went on to say that even though she begged Valentine on the behalf of her sons, that he did not listen to her, as vengeance was on his mind. Please keep in mind that Sarah did not witness the death of her sons, but only was a witness to the events leading up to the pawpaw trees. Indictments. The newspaper does not mention what happened after the deaths of Ellison and the McCoy brothers. There would be 20 indictments handed down to those who participated in the execution of the McCoys. But even with those indictments, there were no arrests made at that time. It would take a while before the charges would be answered in a court of law. There would be 2 men that would be well known for spending the rest of their lives in prison for these actions. Alexander Messer would spend the rest of his life in prison, and then in a prison hospital in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, where he would later die. Valentine Hatfield would also face charges concerning the McCoy brothers, and would face the rest of his life behind bars as well. He would die in prison of an unknown illness. All the while, Valentine Hatfield proclaimed his innocence of this crime. Most of the others that were involved in these murders were sent to jail over other events concerning this feud. Due to the fact that the wheels of justice moved slowly for these events, the McCoys had a great deal of frustration over the matter until it was finally resolved in a court of law. The reading of the article. First, we will read this section of the article as written in the Sun on October 7, 1888. Quote, Chapter 4, Died of a Broken Heart. Talbert's widow was left with quite a little property for a mountaineer's wife. Tolbert was a timber dealer as well as a farmer and had quite an interest in rafts of logs. His widow, quote, was rascaled out of a heap of it, unquote, as Floyd McCoy said, by Talbert's partner. But she still had enough to make her comfortable and provide for the girl baby. In a land where the comforts of life consist of, quote, corn pone and bacon, unquote, and the luxuries of hot biscuits and honey. But the unfortunate widow was not to be comforted by any inheritance. She had been a happy, hearty, handsome wife, according to the accounts of friend and foe. But the grave had not closed over her dead husband before she, quote, began to look puny, unquote. She wept less than her mother-in-law, with whom she had to live. She would even, when the old lady would stop her work to clasp her hands and fall on the floor and cry aloud over the fate of her sons, soothe and comfort her instead of weeping too. But she could not sleep at night because the roar of those guns was ever in her ears. And from day to day she was less able to do the work required of a woman on a farm. Eventually she was unable to leave her bed and finally died, literally of a broken heart. But while the McCoys, if in any way affected, were simply cowed by the murder of the 3 boys, the Hatfields were incited to further deeds. Unquote. We tried to run down which wife this was. Tolbert McCoy supposedly had 3 wives by the name of Mary Butcher McCoy, Cora Nunnery McCoy, and Misty McCoy. We will get into whether or not he had secondary wives later on. But first, we need to explain mountain polygamy and the details of some family living arrangements. Mountain polygamy. If you are a descendant from one of the first settlers into the Appalachian Mountains, don't be shocked if you come across something very odd when it comes to genealogy. It really is not that uncommon to find men who had several wives, concubines, or girlfriends from 1865 through 1900 and sometimes later in time. It is a well-known fact, but not looked upon very lightly. But how and why did it happen? To understand this, when people who speak about the American Civil War, there is a well-known common phrase, brother against brother. The truth of these words were spoken about the men who fought in the Civil War than in the Appalachian Mountains of Kentucky, Western Virginia, Tennessee, and West Virginia. It was pretty common to be on a different side of the war than your actual blood brother. And when the fighting was over, families were often devastated, with one or more of a generation of men no longer walking the face of the earth. In some cases, only the women were left with their husbands, brothers, uncles, fathers, and sometimes sons fighting in the war and to never return home. So, the very few men that did survive and came back to their homes in the Appalachian Mountains were met with a huge surprise. They were now highly sought over. Something had to be done so that the women would not start their own feuds over a man. These women were in dire economic straits. So a kind of uneasy truce was made. A man would have multiple women and families, and this would be overlooked. Several different family structures. The polygamy question had a different way of working out for different families. In all of these cases, the women knew about each other, and they understood the terms and conditions of the arrangements. The most common agreement was the secondary wives would have their own cabins on a farm and keep their own houses. But they had to defer to the rules of the first wife concerning child raising, education, and, of course, time spent with the man in question. This situation did not always work out, though, as the headstrong Appalachian women were working out their pecking order in the families. In those cases, the secondary wife would then be moved into a next situation we will discuss. The next situation of polygamy is where the man would set up a cabin a couple of miles down the road. These women were often secondary wives, concubines, or girlfriends, kind of dependent on how serious the coupling of the 2 people were involved with each other. In many of these cases, even though they knew that the man had a wife, and for whatever reason, they could not get along in the same household, the man would set them up far enough apart so they could all get along. Sometimes it was a matter of the man sticking around long enough to impregnate the woman. In these cases, the widow had no children by the man who had died. Then, the man that she was now going to be, quote, married to, unquote, would lend financial support of that woman and child so that the man who was killed could still have a family that went on through time. Then you had cases where the women could not get along even in the same county. There were cases where the man would have one family in one county or state and walk over to the next county or state to have a second family. The man would simply spend a month with the first wife, cross over the border, and spend a month with a second wife. The famous men of these cases we have already come across: Valentine Hatfield, Clabe Jones, John Wesley Badjohn Wright, and possibly Tolbert McCoy, and many others. Dying of a broken heart. There is such a thing as broken heart syndrome. Some people call it grieving yourself to death. Death is not always the end to this syndrome. It is where a situation is so tragic and the effects of it are so devastating that your heart reacts to it. The effects are often temporary, but people can suffer with it for the rest of their lives or can actually die from it if it's severe enough. We have also seen this happen in the Hatfield and McCoy feud with the death of Rosanna McCoy. So, this part of the story is plausible. I have listed a website in the description box if you want to find out more information from the Mayo Clinic about the broken heart syndrome. Back to Tolbert's wife, Mary Butcher McCoy. First, let's trace down the important dates of each woman as we could find them. According to the sources listed down below, Mary Butcher McCoy was Tolbert's first wife, or lead wife, or legal wife. We know this because she is the only wife with a legal date of marriage. She is always listed first, and even on his gravesite page. Mary Butcher was born in 1860 to 1863 in Pike County, Kentucky. She married Tolbert on March 3, 1881 in Pike County. They had 2 children together, Melvin and Cora McCoy. Now what is interesting about Mary is that she doesn't have a death listed. We also have no date of divorce if one existed. But we have found a report on her daughter Cora McCoy's Find a Grave website describing the night of the burning of the McCoy home. It reads, quote, Report of the Adjutant General of Kentucky, Frankfort, Kentucky, February 6, 1888. And 2 children of Tolbert McCoy, a boy about 7 years old and a little hunchback girl about 5, where they remained till the neighbors arrived about daylight. The heroic girl had her feet badly frostbitten, from which she had not yet recovered, and she could not avoid weeping freely as the old lady detailed to me in her presence the horrors of that terrible night. The little boy, too, is worthy of special mention, for when he emerged from the burning dwelling, when it was almost ready to fall, he thought of his little crippled sister, who was still in the house, and he re-entered it and again came forth, leading her by the hand, nor did he even cry during the whole of the battle. Unquote. So, where was Mary? Why were the children of Tolbert at the home of Randolph McCoy the night that the cabin was burned down? Even more interesting, when she died, why didn't the McCoys bury her near Tolbert? There is no grave marked for Mary McCoy at the McCoy Family Cemetery in Pike County, Kentucky. We could not find a cause of death either. So, could it be that Mary McCoy did die of a broken heart shortly after Tolbert's death? We simply do not have the facts at this time to say whether or not she was the lady that the Sun's article was speaking of. Tolbert's supposed secondary wives, Cora Nunnery and Misty. This is the information that we could find concerning Cora Nunnery McCoy. Cora lived sometime in the years 1895 through 1983 in Floyd County, Kentucky. She was the mother of Luther McCoy, Neely McCoy, Cornelius W. McCoy, Tolbert McCoy Jr., Mabel McCoy Maynard, William Henry McCoy, Veda McCoy Elkins, and Thomas Burley McCoy. Her life does not match the life of Tolbert McCoy that we are speaking about. We can understand, however, how the mix-up happened. When you have a family in a small area that several people have the same names, it is very easy to get them all mixed up, especially when you have 2 people named Cora. We had this problem when we were chasing down Jane Mullins Belcher in the Killing Rock story. In her case, there were multiple Jane Mullinses in the same area in the same time period. In the case of Cora McCoy and Cora Nunnery McCoy, they were 2 separate people from two separate families. Cora McCoy, the daughter of Tolbert McCoy and Mary Belcher McCoy, died in 1888 from a fall. Cora Nunnery McCoy died in 1983 at the age of 87 years old. The Tolbert McCoy she was married to died in Pike County, Kentucky at the age of 77 years old on April 10, 1966. Now, we move on to Misty McCoy. There is not very much information out there about Misty. All we currently know is that she was born between 1824 and 1884. She is listed as the wife of Tolbert McCoy. And that is it. We have no other listing of children, date of their union, or any other information. Until more information comes out about Misty McCoy, we can safely say that we have no idea about her. Was she a secondary wife? We cannot say. But someone has listed her and Cora Nunnery McCoy as secondary wives to Tolbert McCoy on these web pages. Our conclusions. We simply cannot say if the article in the Sun is correct or not about this situation. It is plausible that Tolbert had multiple wives, as this would be in keeping with the time period and the culture that was going on in the mountains after the Civil War. But on the other hand, we cannot slip Cora Nunnery McCoy nor Misty McCoy into those slots either. In the case of Cora Nunnery, she was married to the wrong Tolbert. In the case of Misty, there was not enough information about who she was to definitively say that she was or was not Tolbert's wife. All we can really say about this is that Mary Butcher McCoy can be proven to be Tolbert's wife. We have the date of her marriage to him, but we have no death listed, so we cannot say if the Sun has this story correct or not. However, if this story is true, it would give us the other woman who died during the feud. But on the other hand, the two women counted as casualties of the feud could be Sarah McCoy and Alifair McCoy. And the story of Mary Belcher McCoy's passing could simply be a piece of feud fiction. The reading of the newspaper article. Quote, Chapter 5, Outrages by the Hatfields. Quote, Ants, he's got some boys that's mighty mean. Ants can't do nothing with 'em, and never could. Cap, he's given us trouble ever since he was table high. They've went on and carried on till I don't blame the authorities for trying to punish such trifling fellers. Unquote. That is what Elias Hatfield, brother of Bad Ants, and one of the murderers of the three McCoys, had to say about Ant's boys when asked for a history of the feud by the Sun reporter. In June 1884, an attempt was made to kill both Randolph McCoy and his son Calvin. That resulted in maiming for life two inoffensive citizens through a curious mistake. It will be remembered that the killing of the good Deacon Hatfield occurred at an election when the brother-in-law Tom Stafford was candidate for justice of the peace. Of course, Tom was elected. Now, when Talbert's estate was settled, Calvin looked after the interest of the widow and was obliged to bring several suits to establish her rights. It some way happened that the Logan regulators heard when one of these suits was to have a hearing, and accordingly, knowing that both old Randall and Calvin would be present, formed a plan to kill them both. Cap and John C. Hatfield, Mose Christian, Lee Wilson, Ellison Mounts, Harvey Smith, and Bill Tom Hatfield took guns and hid themselves in the brush on the mountainside a few rods above the road over which the McCoys would travel when going home after the trial. Once their ambush was fixed, a little son of Justice Stafford was seen passing along the road, and Cap stopped him and made him bring an accurate description of the dress and arms of both Randolph McCoy and Calvin. But the boy overlooked one circumstance. Two of the witnesses at the trial, John and Hence Scott, happened to not only be dressed as were Randolph and Calvin McCoy, but they had beards of the same cut and color. The sun had gone down behind a mountain when the trial was over, and the parties to the trial filed out. The first to come were the Scotts. They, with Sam McCoy, son of Randolph, started down the road before the rest appeared. The bushwhackers supposed that they had 3 of the McCoys before them, and as they got opposite of the ambush, fired. One ball pierced John Scott's right knee, and he fell to the ground. Another plowed through Hent Scott's right shoulder directly under Sam McCoy's hand. Sam felt the flesh and clothing rise under his hand as the bullet cut through the flesh and bones. Hence and Sam jumped over the bank down below the road, a mere bridle path, and got out of the sight, while John had to lie there in the dust, exposed to the fire of the bushwhackers. He closed his eyes and lay as still as possible, while the balls cut and plowed up the dirt of the road on both sides of him until he was covered with it. Fortunately, no other ball struck him. Among the regulators, as already mentioned, was Tom Wallace. Tom had married a daughter of Bill Daniels, who lived on the Kentucky side of the Tug River. Tom was so ugly to his wife that she was obliged to leave him and return home. Some time after this, when a raid was contemplated by the Hatfields, the news of it got to the McCoys, so that they fled. Cap Hatfield and Tom Wallace at once concluded that Mrs. Daniels and her daughter, Tom's wife, had betrayed the regulators. So one night Tom and Cap crossed the Tug River to the Daniels cabin. No one ever locks a door in that country unless they are concerned in a feud, and the Daniels door was not even latched. Tom and Cap pushed it open and walked in. The whole family was in bed, all, of course, in one room the cabin contained. A pile of soft coal blazed in the fireplace. Bill Daniels awoke as the intruder strode across the floor. Bill found the muzzle of a cocked repeating rifle in his face as he opened his eyes. It was held by Tom Wallace, and he was told to lie still and say nothing. Then Cap ordered Mrs. Daniels and Mrs. Wallace, her daughter, out of bed. The women obeyed, but began to cry and plead for mercy, at which Cap laughed in glee. He carried in his hand a tail of a cow, which he had cut from an unfortunate brute some time before, just to see her jump, and had it hung up and dried it. He flourished this about his head, and then, grabbing Mrs. Daniels by the hair, forced her to her knees in front of the fireplace, and began beating her across the back, using the heavy bone of the cow's tail to strike her with. The blows were delivered with a will. The woman screamed in agony, for the first 2 blows broke 2 ribs, while her cries were added to those of her daughter and several children. Bill Daniels, the husband and father, groaned and turned his head, but Tom ordered him under the pain of death to turn back and keep his eyes on the whipping. For Mrs. Daniels, Cap turned to Mrs. Wallace, her daughter. His arm was somewhat weary now, and he could not beat her to his satisfaction, so he took the gun from Wallace, who, with fresh strength, beat the woman anew. This actual beating lasted over 40 minutes by a little old clock that stood over the fireplace on a shelf. When it was over, both women lie on the floor unconscious. Dead, Daniels supposed, though Mrs. Daniels afterward partly recovered, and Mrs. Wallace is in good health now. Mrs. Daniels' lungs were affected, and she will probably die of consumption inside of a year. Unquote. The 2 stories of the trial. There are 2 versions as to why John and his brother Henderson, hence Scott, went to the trial for the McCoys. We will give both reasons and let you decide which one was more plausible. According to the Hatfield and McCoy feud Wikipedia post, the McCoys knew that the Hatfields had been indicted in court for the deaths of Tolbert, Farmer, and Bud McCoy. But so far, there were no arrests and no trial. This frustrated the McCoy family, and so they took their case to Perry Cline. The Hatfields got word of this action, and so they planned the ambush against Randolph and his son Calvin during their return home from Cline. According to the Sun article, the McCoys had gone to court for a completely different reason. After the death of Tolbert, his estate was now in question. It was now up to Calvin to protect the holdings of his sister-in-law. To establish her rights, Calvin had to file several lawsuits. As we read in Chapter 4, Tolbert's widow was being taken advantage of by Tolbert's partner, and he was trying to take all of the business and earnings away from her. Knowing that this was going on, the Hatfields found an opportunity to rid themselves of the two McCoy men, since they knew where they were going to be. So, whichever way this actually came about, we do know that Calvin and his father Randolph McCoy was in town to try to seek justice for their family, either by the murder charges or to defend Tolbert's widow from financial ruin because of his death. Was John and Henderson Scott murdered? Again, we have two versions of these events. First, let us say that we tried our best to look up both men. There are several John and Henderson Scotts from Mingo County, West Virginia, and Pike County, Kentucky. However, none of the dates of their living or sibling list matched the story. According to the Hatfield and McCoy feud page, we have the following story. It seems that Ance Hatfield ordered his son Cap and other gunmen to stop Randolph McCoy in his pursuit of justice. But instead of hitting their target, they killed John and Henderson Scott. Sam McCoy is not mentioned to be in their company. There are no charges filed against the Hatfields for these alleged deaths. However, Cline was able to use his political connections to reinstate the charges against the Hatfields for the murders of the McCoy brothers. Now, for the Sun's version of the events. It is not clear how the Logan regulators, the Hatfield faction of the feud, heard about the day at court. However, they took advantage of the fact and planned to ambush Randolph and Calvin. We have a listing of the men involved, in which the Wikipedia page does not provide. Supposedly, we have Cap and John Hatfield, Mose Christian, Lee Wilson, Ellison Mounts, Harvey Smith, and Bill Tom Hatfield, all loaded for bear and setting themselves up for the ambush. They even stopped a boy on the side of the road to ask for a description of the McCoys, not thinking that there possibly could be innocent men who matched the description. But were they really innocent according to the Hatfields? It seems that both John and Hence were going to be a witness in the trial against the Hatfields, and this marked them for death. Going forward with the story, the Scotts got to the place in the road, and the bushwhackers opened fire. John Scott was injured when he was shot in the right knee. Henderson and Sam McCoy dove into the bridle path across from the Hatfield position. John was unable to get off the road, and so he played dead on the spot. So many bullets were flying all around him on the dusty road that he was covered in dirt after the shooting had stopped. Evidently, Sam McCoy had his hand on Henderson Scott's right shoulder. Scott was shot, and McCoy felt the shot, but was otherwise uninjured when they dove into the bridle path below the road and hid themselves to keep from being shot further. So, was the Scott brothers killed at this point or not? We simply cannot say for sure. Until more information about the brothers comes online, we simply have to say that both stories are currently plausible. We also traced all of the websites to see what we could find out about the Scott brothers in the McCoy line. We simply could not find their names listed. So for now, we can't even say that they were related to the McCoy family. The two stories do merge after this point in the feud, and we suspect that more information will become available in the future concerning John and Henderson Scott. Mary Magdalene McCoy Daniels. First, we will talk about the history of the only undisputed woman in this story, Mary was the daughter of Asa Harmon McCoy and Martha Klein. She was born in Pike County, Kentucky on February 15, 1848. Mary McCoy married William Bill Daniels on November 22, 1866. Daniels was the son of Richard Daniels and Margaret Charles of Pike County, Kentucky. Mary gave birth to 14 children and also helped to raise a few grandchildren into adulthood. Her children grew up on a working farm that William and Mary had provided. The farmhouse was large and set along the Tug River near Freeburn, Kentucky. There was a fireplace in each bedroom. The Daniels cabin was so large that church and funeral services were held in her home. According to all versions of the story, Mary was dragged out of bed in the middle of the night by Cap Hatfield. She was forced upon her knees in front of the fireplace in the bedroom and beaten by him. Her husband was forced to watch at gunpoint. Mary suffered the worst of the night, and this was so severe that 2 of Mary's ribs were broken and her lungs were damaged. Because of the damage, everyone thought that she would die inside of a year from consumption. But did she? It turns out that Mary would outlive her husband by 40 years. She never remarried and would sell off her land in her later years. Mary died on April 11, 1939, at the age of 91 years old. Victoria Daniels. Victoria was born on March 13, 1870, in Pike County, Kentucky, to William and Mary Daniels. She was the second born of 14 children. Her headstone reads that she was born in 1873 and her name was Charles. But this is in conflict with the family Bible that reads her birth had taken place in 1870 and her name was Daniels, not Charles. Victoria married William Thomas Tom Wallace in 1886 in Logan County, West Virginia. There is no date for the divorce. She would go on to marry William Thompson Charles on March 28, 1889 in Pike County, Kentucky. They would also divorce, but we do not have the date. Victoria would go on to marry a third time to Johnson Anderson Dotson in 1907. John and Victoria would move to Oliver, Ohio in 1910. We tend to believe that the son would be correct about the other woman at the cabin being Victoria. However, it is not correct that she was Tom Wallace's legal wife at that time. They could have simply been living together. However, it was during this time that Tom Wallace was being mean to Victoria. And it would only make sense that since she left him over it, he needed to take out his anger and frustration on her. The most dangerous time for a woman is when she actually attempts to leave the abusive situation. It would not be out of the realm of behavioral possibility that Tom Wallace told Cap Hatfield that she was responsible for the supposed betrayal and she needed to face punishment for it. All the while, he wanted to punish her for leaving him. This is typical behavior in abusive situations. A huge clue in the Sun article that makes us lean more toward Victoria being the victim in this situation is that Tom Wallace himself whipped the woman. Now we have to say this. Many find it strange that Victoria ended up marrying and later divorcing Thomas after the night at the Daniels cabin. And again, we do not know if the pair were living together before they were married or not. But without judgment, we will say that the marriage of the pair is not that unusual. They had no children together during their entire relationship. We do know that Victoria outlived Thomas by 12 years. Thomas died on September 16, 1933 at the age of 84 in Guyan, Wyoming County, West Virginia. Victoria died on June 24, 1945 in Phelps, Pike County, Kentucky at the age of 75. Nancy L. McCoy Hatfield Phillips. Nancy was the youngest daughter born to Asa Harmon McCoy and Martha Klein McCoy sometime in August 1865 in Pike County, Kentucky. Nancy and Mary were indeed sisters. Nancy would marry John C. Hatfield in 1881. Johnson and Nancy would have 2 children together. There is no date for her divorce from him. She would go on to marry Frank Phillips Sr. in 1895. She would have 2 children by Frank, one who died as an infant, and raised 3 children that belonged to Frank. Frank would die just 3 years after their marriage. We will give the reason why it would not be plausible for Nancy to be the second woman at the cabin, but she could have been the catalyst. At the time, she was married to Johnson Hatfield. She would have still been pregnant with her first child, William Anderson Anstey Hatfield, who would have been born on August of 1884. The family would have considered her untouchable as she was carrying a Hatfield child. The risk would have been too great for her losing the child for her to endure the beating by Tom Wallace. One plausible story. We could see the possibility of this situation happening. Let's suppose that Nancy was at the home of Aunt Hatfield when she got word that he gave orders for Calvin and Randolph McCoy to be ambushed while coming home from court. She could have said that she wanted to visit her sister and niece since her time of childbirth was drawing near. While visiting her 2 kinswomen, she could have given them the heads up about what was going to happen to their uncle and first cousin. While she could not tell the men directly what she had witnessed, she told the next best people to relay the message to them. After Nancy had left the cabin, we can visualize that either Mary or Victoria, or even both of them, went to their Uncle Randolph to give the message. Now, think on this a moment. What if, and we are only saying what if here, Randolph talked to the Scott brothers to dress like them as a way of protecting the 3 ladies who told them of the plot? And also, as a sort of protection, Sam McCoy went along with the Scott brothers in case of trouble. Then, Randolph and Calvin would leave the trial by using a different direction home. It seems odd that the McCoys and the Scotts were dressed in the same manner accidentally. We realize that that could happen, but really, what were the odds? A second plausible story. Let's back up and start that again, shall we? Nancy McCoy Hatfield learns of the plot to kill her uncle and her cousin. She tells Victoria and Mary all about it. But it's just gossip between women and it goes no further. Or, just to be spicy, they tell Randolph and Calvin, but they do nothing about it. The fact that the Scott brothers were dressed just like them is pure coincidence. The McCoys get done with their court business concerning Tolbert's widow and stay back to talk to Perry Cline about the Hatfields murder trial case. In the meantime, the Scott brothers and Sam McCoy start on their way home. Randolph and Calvin McCoy are not that far behind them. The shooting begins, the McCoys hear it, and then turn around and take another path home. Conclusion of Chapter 5. But either plausible way, the women were still punished for gossiping about the potential ambush, and blamed for Randolph and Calvin McCoy still being alive. But were they really guilty of this? Were they the ones that warned the McCoys of the ambush? Or was it mere coincidence that Nancy chose that time to go speak to her sisters? But this event is not over. There will be more bloodshed over the events that happened at the Daniels cabin.
The reading of the Sun newspaper. Quote, Chapter 6, Jeff McCoy's murdered. There are 2 stories of the murder that followed this assault. The McCoys tell this. Mrs. Daniels was the sister of Jeff McCoy, who was a cousin of Randolph's boys. Sometime after Mrs. Daniels had been beaten, bad aunts met Jeff McCoy in the road and greeted him in a friendly way. Jeff had never taken any part in the feud and had always been well treated by both sides. Aunt said that he was mighty sorry about the beating Mrs. Daniels had got and that Cap was making him a heap of trouble. But Cap was his own boy, and a father must stand by a son. There was no reason for standing by Tom Wallace, however, and if Jeff would like to get even with his ornery pictures, Ance was the man to help the matter on. Jeff was profuse in his thanks, and it was agreed that Jeff should go over to Aunt's house, that Tom should be invited there and given over to Jeff. who should then escort him to Pikeville Jail and have him sent to the penitentiary. The plan worked well up to the meeting of Jeff and Wallace, which happened at John C. Hatfield's home on Grapevine Creek. Then the program was changed. Jeff was made the prisoner of Tom Wallace and tied with a rope to Tom Wallace's saddle and driven like a pig down Grapevine Creek to Cap Hatfield's house. It is said that Cap nearly laughed himself sick when he saw Jeff driven into his yard and learned how neatly the old man had worked on the unsophisticated mind of McCoy. When he had recovered his composure, however, he got down the repeating rifle and told Tom to drive the victim down the road until opposite the Daniels cabin. There, they would kill him in sight of his sister. Cap lived at the mouth of Grapevine Creek on the bank of Tug River. 1 mile below the mouth of Thacker Creek lived Shang Bill Farrell. At Shang's house, the two men, with their prisoner, stopped in order that Cap might get a drink. Jeff saw a chance to slip the rope from the horn of Tom's saddle, and did so, and in a moment had jumped the low fence around Shang's yard and plunged headlong from an 8-foot bank into the river. He escaped to the Kentucky shore with only a flesh wound in his left arm. But once on shore, he lost his head. First, he sought refuge behind a bush that could scarce have sheltered a rabbit. Then he fled when that grew too hot, up the bare mountainside, straight away from the enemy, when he might have run down the river and in 6 jumps gained a big oak and plenty of big beech trees. He had crossed nearly half an open space, however, when a ball from Cap's gun killed him. According to the Hatfields, Jeff had stabbed a neighbor and fled to Virginia for harbor. Ants and Johnsy agreed to take him in, but Cap opposed it. Jeff was at Johnsy's house 3 weeks, Johnsy having married Jeff's sister. Then Jeff went down to Cap's house and got into a quarrel with Tom Wallace, whom he met there, and shot Tom, inflicting a slight wound. Cap then arrested Jeff and was taking him into a justice when he escaped. Unquote. What we knew at the time. It always amazes us how much information comes out over time. And if we are patient, we get to rewrite what was previously learned about those cases we talk about, such as the case with Jeff McCoy. Here is what we said about this in our previous documentary. Quote, Jeff McCoy killed Fred Wolford, who was a mail carrier. The reasons for this murder are currently unknown, as well as its connection to the feud. Acting as constable, Cap Hatfield and his friend Tom Wallace were acting upon a warrant to arrest Jeff McCoy for this murder. Both men shot Jeff while he was trying to escape on the banks of the Tug Fork River. Tom Wallace was found dead in the spring of 1887. Unquote. There simply wasn't a lot to say because of no information at that time. But since more information is out, let's dive into the story of Jeff McCoy. We will give both versions of the story, but as the old saying goes, there's point A's truth, point B's truth, and the exact truth lays somewhere in the middle. Who was Louis Jefferson Jeff McCoy? According to the information on the Find a Grave website, Louis Jefferson Jeff McCoy was born on October 13th, 1859 in Pike County to Asa Harmon McCoy and Martha Patsy Klein McCoy. Jeff's siblings were Mary Magdalene McCoy Daniels, Jacob Jake McCoy, Larkin Howard Lark McCoy, Asa Harmon Bud McCoy Jr., and Nancy L. McCoy Hatfield Phillips. Jeff would go on to marry Sarah Wolford McCoy on October 30th, 1880. They had 4 children together: Perry Lee McCoy, Louis Jefferson Jeff McCoy Jr., Maud Ellen McCoy Boland, and Nettie Marie McCoy Velchik. According to the Ancestors website, Jeff and his family lived in Precinct 7, Peters Creek, Pike County, Kentucky, United States in 1880. Now, the Sun newspaper reported that Jeff McCoy was not involved in the feud. However, we found that this information may not be correct. It seems that even though he was not one of the main players in the feud, he did play a significant role in what happened. According to the Find a Grave website, it states the following, quote, in September of 1885, he shot and wounded Tom Wallace, a Hatfield associate. In March of 1886, he and Andrew Wolford stabbed Fred Wolford. In December of 1886, Cap Hatfield shot Jeff to death at Tug River. In 1887, the Commonwealth dropped a Wolford murder charge and a horse theft case against him due to his death. Unquote. But we have more information about what happened and the two sides to the story. But first, let's find out who Fred Wolford was. Who was Frederick Fred Wolford? There is not a lot of information currently online about Wolford. However, his death was very important to the timeline of the Hatfield and McCoy feud. We do not know for certain if he was any relation to Jeff McCoy's wife, Sarah, even though they have the same last surname. But, according to our source below, it seems that Sarah could have been Fred's niece. But we could not verify this. Fred's parents are not listed on the Find a Grave website, but his birth of April 3rd, 1846 is. He was married to Sarah Sally Hurley Wolford, and they had a daughter named Amarinda Wolford Dodson. According to the information we were able to find out about him, he was a mail carrier in King's Yarn and also a farmer, and that during the Civil War he served in the Union 39th Kentucky Infantry. The two stories of the death of Fred Wolford. We have more information about these crimes from the writings of Tom Dodson in his blog, Hatfields and McCoy's, Going Over to the Other Side. Dodson tells us in his article that there were two sides to the stabbing of Wolford. According to the story that Professor Otis Rice relays to Dodson, the Hatfields and the McCoys stayed on their side of the Tug River. They did not cross over for just any reason. Jeff and his brother-in-law, Andrew Wolford Jr., went to Peters Creek in Pike County, Kentucky, and stabbed to death Fred Wolford. The reason behind this was not given. Dodson also relates a view of the stabbing as told by Dean King. According to King, there was a dance that took place in Pike County for the Election Day festivities. According to King, the death of Fred Wolford happened because of a Wolford family argument and had nothing to do with the Hatfield and McCoy feud. Fred Wolford called Jeff McCoy a liar. For this insult, McCoy drew a pistol and shot Wolford dead on the spot. King states that both were indicted for the crime on September 9, 1886. Dodson writes that either during or after the death of Wolford, Jeff McCoy stole a horse and ran to his brother-in-law, Johnson Hatfield's home in West Virginia. The charges of horse theft and murder were dropped against Jeff McCoy upon his death. Special thank you. We would like to thank Thomas Dodson for his tireless work finding the information that he did about Jeff McCoy. We understand how hard research is, and we always like to recognize the Appalachian researchers out there that share their information to keep history correct. Well done, sir. We truly appreciate your efforts and encourage everyone to read your work. Links are in the description box below. Where we currently stand in the story. As we discussed in our last video, Jeff McCoy and Andrew Wolford was in trouble for the murder of Fred Wolford. Both men, now had a warrant out for the arrest for the murder of Wolford, and the other document has to do with the dismissal of the charges due to the death of McCoy. The following are existing copies of these warrants. In August term of the 10th day of September, 1886, a warrant was issued for the arrest of Jeff McCoy and Andrew Wolford for the murder of Fred Wolford. Again, we wish to recognize Thomas Dodson for his work in finding these two valuable arrest warrants. The first warrant may or may not have been the reason behind the death of Jeff McCoy. After all, we do have two stories going on at the same time when it comes to what happened, and both of them are plausible to take place at the same time and be the reason behind the shooting of Jeff McCoy. On the February term of the 8th day of March, 1887, the murder charges were dismissed against McCoy because he was dead. Now, it took a couple of months for this case to wind itself through the court system and for the dismissal to take place. After all, McCoy was killed in December of 1886. The Appalachians have never been a place where things are accomplished quickly. It has always been a hurry up and wait and see game here. But it is nice to see a document where the charges were actually dropped, even though it was in the case of death. Buying an election. Now we are going to make this statement right here. We understand that what we are going to state sounds very familiar with the theories and conspiracies of today, but they are not in any way related, and we ask everyone to please refrain from comments about current elections. Thank you so much for your understanding. Continuing on. Despite what Professor Otis Rice states about the McCoys and Hatfields staying on their side of the river, there were some crossovers between the two families. One of which was the crossing of the river by McCoy to run from the law. McCoy did not bring a bunch of armed men with him when he crossed over the Tug River. He simply traveled by himself across the Tug River to go stay with Johnson and Nancy. Another unarmed instance would be when Johnson Hatfield was known to cross the Tug River in 1886. Johnson Hatfield would be charged with attempting to buy votes on Peter Creek, Kentucky, for the Democrat Party. At that time in history, Peter Creek was in a solid Republican district. Asa Harmon McCoy Jr. was Johnson's partner in subverting the election process, and while staying with Johnson, Jeff would also join in with this scheme. However, we could not find where Asa Harmon, Bud McCoy Jr., nor Jeff McCoy was ever charged with this crime. Now, we have a theory about this. Could Jeff and Bud also have been caught up in this scheme, but because they were just minor players, they simply were set free? And if they were caught, why wasn't Jeff McCoy brought in for the murder charges? Did the authorities there know about the indictment against him? These will forever be unanswered questions. But we do find it interesting that Jeff was kinda in the middle of this vote buying scheme and never did face charges over it. But this also goes to show that even though McCoy was under the murder indictment, he had no fear in going back and forth into Kentucky. And this lack of fear of being put into the Pike County Jail would end up leading to his death. McCoy hears about the Daniels home. Now, sometime while McCoy was helping Asa Harmon and Johnson out with their voting scheme, he hears about what happened at the Daniels home. These women were Jeff's sister and possible niece or another sister involved in this event. It would not be long before McCoy would seek justice for his family. According to the sources, McCoy and Josiah Hurley set out to capture Tom Wallace and send him to the Pike County Jail to face punishment for the assault against the McCoy women. Wallace was able to escape from McCoy in the first arrest attempt. Now, according to the Sun article, in December of 1886, word got out that Jeff McCoy was trying to bring in Tom Wallace for assault. Ance Hatfield approached Jeff McCoy and apologized for the actions of his son, Cap Hatfield, and said that he would not stop him and would help. Ants told McCoy to come by the Hatfields' home and he would make sure that Wallace was there. And from there, McCoy could take Wallace to the Pikeville jail. When McCoy came to the Hatfield home, he was captured by Tom Wallace instead and tied to Wallace's horse. This was under the pretense that Tom Wallace was going to take McCoy in for the murder of Fred Wolford. After picking up Cap Hatfield on the way, the men went toward the Tug River across from the Daniels cabin. The new plan was to kill McCoy inside of his sister, Mary Daniels. Along the way, the men stopped at Shane Bill Farrell's home for Cap to get a drink. Jeff McCoy was able to slip his bonds and jump into the Tug River, at which point Wallace and Hatfield opened fire and McCoy died. Chapter 7 of the Sun's article will deal with the indictments of Tom Wallace and Cap Hatfield for this action. Motives. We have to take a step back and take a look at all of the motives here. On Jeff McCoy's side, Jeff wanted justice for his family. He was planning on taking in Tom Wallace for what he did at the Daniels cabin. Nowhere does it mention that he had the same plan for Cap Hatfield. And we have to ask why. Was it because Tom Wallace was married into the family? After all, he was married to Jeff's niece, Victoria. And Wallace and Victoria had a very contentious relationship. So, was there more at play here, with Jeff standing up against Tom's treatment of his wife? Also, why didn't Jeff McCoy want to bring in Cap Hatfield for the same charges? Was it because, at the time, Hatfield was a lawman and the charges would be harder to stick? Or could it have been that Jeff McCoy considered all of this an in-house McCoy matter to be dealt with? And what about the other side of the coin? Did Cap Hatfield and Tom Wallace really want to turn in McCoy for the murder charges? Was the whole plan that Hatfield and Wallace concocted solely for the purpose to kill Jeff McCoy in front of his own sister Mary? Was their contempt for Mary Daniels so bad that they felt that they had to kill her brother in front of her face? Was the beating not enough that they had to send her a stronger message to stay out of things that didn't concern her? They could have simply taken McCoy to the Pikeville jail on the murder charges. Were they afraid that McCoy could have been found not guilty? Or was this simply an excuse they could use to kill McCoy? Thank you. Kentucky Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video series on the myths and truths of the Hatfield and McCoy feud. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell notification button. Please be sure to double check that you are subscribed, as some of our viewers are finding that they are no longer subscribed to our channel. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries in Appalachian history.